One of Ukraine's biggest fears is the election of Donald Trump, because not only will U.S. support likely stall in that scenario, but Russia will very much feel empowered to do whatever they want with impunity.
Hey, welcome to Tim Mak, founder of the Counter Offensive, a news site on Substack, headquartered in Kyiv. Mak's team is telling the personal stories of people threatened by authoritarianism. Welcome back to the Bulwark Podcast, brother. It's good to see you.
It's great to see you.
We are coming up on the 2-year anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I guess we're 2 days away from the 2-year anniversary. Last weekend, the eastern city of Avdiivka fell to Russia. This has been maybe their most significant territorial victory in 9-10 months. Talk to us about the state of play there and what you're seeing on the ground.
Well, look, I got to tell you that the morale in Ukraine is as low as I've seen it in a really, really long time. And a lot of this has to do, unfortunately, with the United States. And in particular, the United States and the West saying that they would be with Ukraine to the end and then not following through with those promises. I think there's a big feeling of betrayal right now in Ukraine, not to mention a lot of despair over the current battlefield situation. And so, folks in Ukraine follow U.S. congressional procedures and legislation sometimes more closely than a lot of Americans, because for them it's not just a matter of policy or legislation; it's a matter of actual lives, the lives of their family members, their cousins, their friends, their partners. It's life or death for them. And what is a real risk is what was originally an American strategic victory in Ukraine turning into a real risk of a strategic defeat. That is, that Ukraine, feeling sort of betrayed as it is, could turn on the West, which they viewed as a friend and a close partner, now as someone who can't be trusted. And that has implications not only for Ukraine, but all over the world, any place where the U.S. says, trust us, we'll back you.
Yeah, and this fear of being abandoned by the U.S. and confusion about what's happening. And there was the story that Zelensky was sharing in the briefing this week that kind of leaked out about the soldier who's on the ground, like looking at his phone for news about what's happening in the American Congress while there are bombs that are landing around them. Is that representative? I mean, in your conversations there, how focused are people on what is happening in America, and how critical is more quick action in America to trying to turn the momentum around?
Yeah, I mean, it really sometimes does stun me how much people outside the United States care about the minutia of what's happening in the U.S. Congress, and how sometimes, someone, over lunch was saying to me, that's, just like Newt Gingrich's contract with America in the mid-90s. Just threw in a reference to that, just events and politics that a lot of Americans aren't even familiar with, become really important to folks all over the world, because the United States, when it says that it's a beacon for freedom and stands for democracy, people abroad take that really, really very seriously. And when we say that, when America says that, other folks pay attention to what we do after making those kinds of promises. And so bringing that back to what's happening in Ukraine, I think there's a great sense of imminent betrayal, perhaps. But as the war kind of seems to be going against Ukrainian momentum, folks are going to want to find reasons and explanations and unfortunately, people and institutions to blame.
Yeah. So when you're there, I mean, the sense of how, obviously so many people have gone to serve in this war. And I was just reading a book about World War I, in the absence of men, just about the sense of the hollowed out cities while people are on the front lines. What is happening in Kyiv? I know that people are being conscripted. Is there a sense of this absence of this huge part of the of society that is either serving or that has died in the war? What's that like actually on the ground in Kyiv?
Well, you won't talk to a single person who hasn't been affected in a deeply personal way by deaths and injuries in Ukraine. I mean, everyone knows someone, and it's one of those. This is one of those wars that has been extremely personal. You'll remember in the early days of the invasion, the Russians surrounded Kyiv and were bombing places in the city. So it's deeply intimate for folks. They have gone through it. It's not some sort of far off event that's occurring. And there are air raids and air raid alerts almost every day. It kind of becomes in this strange way integrated into all aspects of of your life. There's an app for that. There's actually an app that will ring when the air alerts are sounding in your region. And so it's one of those things where not only are there the physical traumas of amputations and injuries and death, but it's this terrible mental trauma that's accumulating and it's cascading from person to person. You can tell. I mean, I've seen so many people who earlier in the war I would have pegged as people who were, absolutely rock solid folks who you can't imagine them breaking under psychological pressure. And I'm seeing them break. I'm seeing them be really affected by the cumulative effects of this war. It's really heartbreaking to see. But it's one of those things that we're trying to give voice to at the counteroffensive. We're trying to tell these deeply reported human stories that illustrate what's happening in a way that other news outlets aren't, in order to try to cut through this idea of Ukraine fatigue, writing these stories that would be interesting to read, whether they were set in Ukraine or not. I mean, I'm deeply passionate about that.
What do you have a most memorable story that you've been working on since you started the counteroffensive? Yeah,
I mean, we've done a lot of really important stories outside of the mainstream. I mean, one of our most recent stories was about a Ukrainian folk music player who lost one of his arms in a drone attack, and how he is trying to change this Ukrainian folk music string instrument in order to be able to play again. I mean, we've done these deep stories about what it's like for Ukrainian comedians near the front lines, as well as medics evacuating from eastern Ukraine, the Donbass, all the way to central Ukraine. We've done stories about Russian persecution of occupied Christian pastors in formerly Ukrainian-held territories and now Russian-held territories. So we've done story after story about individuals going through the war in order to make it feel more intimate and more real for folks who are reading thousands of miles away.
Yeah, I was struck by the story about the persecuted pastors because there have been accusations going both ways on this. Right, the Russophile right in America has made claims that it's actually Zelensky that's been persecuting Russian Orthodox ministers. And your story about, boy, I'm not even going to try to pronounce his name correctly. Maybe, well, I'll give it a shot. Then you can give it right. Tim Mak Kosybekov. I thought that just really struck me, the degree to which the maybe less non-denominational, non-Russian Orthodox Protestant religious officers are being targeted by Russia. Could you talk about that story a bit?
Yeah. So, for example, folks who are part of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church or the Baptist ministry, which is very popular in Ukraine, are seen by Russians as suspect, as under suspicion. They think that they might be under the control of Western intelligence or something like that, and without any evidence to support it. And it's really interesting because, of course, some of the folks that Ukraine realizes that it needs to win over is the evangelical right and Protestants in the U.S. who might be skeptical towards their cause. So it's one of those topics that really strikes through not only on a personal lens, but also may have some appeal with some of the folks who are on the right in the United States who may be either on the fence or unsure about how to view Ukraine and Russia. But I think but this might change some minds.
In the before times, maybe it would change some minds, right? You would hope that it would change some minds, but just the nature of just how entrenched the right has gotten. We're talking about this also in the podcast today about the the false stories about Biden and Burisma that got pushed by Russian intelligence. We saw Tucker Carlson last week in Russia. Ukrainians that you talk to have to just be absolutely exacerbated by this, right? Like, how is it that Ronald Reagan's party has gotten so deep into kind of the Russian propaganda mill? Like, I assume people in Ukraine are much more familiar with the Russian methods, right? So, like, what are folks saying there about what's been happening?
Well, I think you're right that they're familiar with Russian methods, and so for them nothing is new under the sun, right? But there's still a lot of consternation about Tucker Carlson, who's seen in Ukraine as kind of a useful idiot for Putin. But there's also like a lot of confusion and anger towards people like Elon Musk, and people like Donald Trump. I mean, there's a lot of fear. I mean, if we just take a step back strategically, I mean, one of Ukraine's biggest fears is the election of Donald Trump, because not only will U.S. support likely stall in that scenario, but Russia will very much feel empowered to do whatever they want with impunity, should that occur. European leaders are also deeply, deeply concerned about that kind of scenario.
Yeah, I mean, what, practically speaking, is the idea of Trump getting reelected? I mean, like, what, when you say the Ukrainians fear it? Yeah, of course they fear it, but I mean, is this war sustainable if Donald Trump becomes president and there's no U.S. support anymore, and we're already seeing the tangible results of the U.S. delays in support? What happens if U.S. support ends?
I mean, there's a real risk that Ukraine could lose the war. I mean, resistance will continue. I mean, there's an old saying that as long as there's a 12-year-old boy with a plastic fork in Ukraine, there'll continue to be resistance against Russian occupation. But it could mean that major cities fall. It could mean that Kyiv is threatened again. I mean, Russia has made no secret of its intentions, which is to dominate and subjugate as much of Ukraine as possible. The city of Kharkiv is 25 kilometers from the Russian border. If they had the ability and wore down Ukrainian forces and defenses, they could go after the second largest city in Ukraine, Kharkiv, surround it, besiege it, and then put millions of people through this terrible suffering. With a view, from the Russian perspective, with a view towards occupying and controlling it. These are the consequences if the United States and the rest of the West doesn't fulfill its obligations and its promises to Ukraine, and that's a real worry among Ukrainians about how they're going to continue militarily and economically without the support of the West.
Yeah, there are a couple of specific stories I want to get have you share a little more color with us on. This morning, you have a story looking back at the Battle of Antonov Airfield, and the kind of deep reporting that you guys did. It's one of the early battles of the invasion. Talk to us about like what you learned and what that experience was like.
Yeah, so we spent the better part of the last year interviewing dozens and dozens of people who were present at this Battle of Antonov Airfield, which took place in the first 72 hours or so of the full-scale invasion. And, this really relates to what I was saying about, a 12-year-old boy with a plastic fork. There's a story in our reporting about a member of the Ukraine armed forces that, lacking ammo, saw a bunch of Russian soldiers near the airfield and decided to try to run him over with his car, which he and his convoy did repeatedly in order to fight back. I mean, this is the nature of Ukrainian resistance, and you will see it continue. Now, do we want to put our Ukrainian partners in a position where they need to be fighting with plastic forks and BMWs? Obviously not. They need artillery, they need drones, they need armored vehicles. Essentially, they need what the United States promised from the very beginning. And you could see a narrative forming, particularly among Russian propagandists talking to Ukrainians saying, well, the Americans, they encouraged you to fight. They said we'd back you. And then just at the moment where you're most vulnerable, they walked away from you. And you could see that being a very effective narrative, right? If things go badly, and especially if the United States doesn't keep its word.
Yeah. Finally, you've just been doing so much. Once again, it's the counteroffensive on Substack. People should be reading more about these stories. We hear so much about the kidnapping of the children from Russia, and how that impact has been on Ukraine. What have you kind of learned about that and the extent of it, and the negotiations upon getting some of these children back? What's the latest on that story?
Well, look, it's one of those stories that really illustrates what happens behind enemy lines. It's one of those stories that shows what Russia intends to do with people in areas that it's occupied. It's a story about children, of course, which is particularly horrific. But Russia really wants to apply this sort of propagandistic method of so-called patriotic education, not only to children but to adults, to erase the very idea of the Ukrainian citizenship and nationhood. And for Russia, it's not a matter about children per se. It's a matter of extinguishing a culture and a language and an identity which they don't believe has any right to exist. Russia wants to subjugate Ukraine not merely for the territory or for the economic resources that it might hold. It's really very fertile agricultural sector and that sort of thing. But it really is driven by Putin's ideological opposition to the very concept of an independent Ukraine that exists separate and apart from Russia.
Thank you to Tim Mak. I really, really admire the work you're doing with Counteroffensive News, and hope to get you back here next time with maybe a more uplifting report about the status of Ukraine. Thanks, brother.